50 years of World Heritage. What has been achieved? What has not been achieved? What has to be done in face of this war? This session will be moderated by Professor Friedrich Schipper. He is Executive President of Blue Shield Austria. Professor Schipper is an archaeologist and specialized with cultural heritage of the Near East. He has been actively engaged in illicit trafficking in cultural property and civil-military cooperation, among others. He is a chairperson of the Competence Center for Cultural Heritage Management and Communication at University of Vienna. He is serving as Cultural Property Protection Officer at the Austrian Peacekeeper Association and the Theresian Military Academy of the Austrian Armed Forces. Please welcome Professor Schipper to the podium. And I have a book for Dr. Rimbeck to have a good memory of this conference.
Thank you very much. Two most important things. I have not been actively involved in illicit trafficking, but in combating illicit trafficking. Second, the 10 minutes of my introduction are already consumed. So I will reduce my introduction to one sentence. Beyond the fact that we are celebrating the 50 years of the World Heritage Convention against the backdrop of a very close armed conflict, this armed conflict is nevertheless not the focus of our conference. It's the role of civil society in protecting cultural heritage. And this is what the upcoming session is focusing on and was composed by Marie-Therese Albert by selecting the keynote speaker and the panelists. And I want to go straight away to introduce our keynote speaker, Joseph King, who is the Senior Director in the Office of the Director General of ICCROM. Joseph King provides support for the Director General in the implementation of the mandates of the organization with the particular focus on governance. He is an architect and urban planner, and he also leads a team of professionals in all aspects of ICCROM's role as an advisory body to the UNESCO World Heritage Convention, where he has represented ICCROM for 25 years. ICCROM, by the way, is not just an advisory body to UNESCO in terms of the World Heritage Convention, but also in terms of the Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict. At ICCROM, he has been Director of Partnership and Communication and Director of the Sites Unit responsible for capacity building programs and for the conservation of immovable cultural heritage around the world. Mr. Joseph King, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Schipper, and I would very much like to take the opportunity to thank the organizers of this event, the Institute for Heritage Studies, particularly Professor Marie-Therese Albert, thank you very much, and also the German Federal Office for the opportunity really to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the World Heritage Convention with friends and colleagues who are throughout this room today. And I really do appreciate the possibility of being able to be with all of my friends, because I've been working now for 25 years in World Heritage, and I'm actually half the age. My work in World Heritage is exactly half the age of the convention itself. So, I'm really appreciative of this possibility. I would also like to take the opportunity, because she's going to be embarrassed, everyone keeps mentioning her, to mention Brigitte Ringbach also, because everyone knows her work on World Heritage as a member of the World Heritage Committee, as the German person working in Germany on this. But for 8 years, she was also a council member at ICCROM. And that's a little bit more behind the scenes. But actually, I would argue, at least as important, to make sure that ICCROM is running in the right direction, and she was a key person for many years in doing that. So I'd like to actually join also in paying tribute to a really great career. Finally, just in terms of introduction, I bring greetings on behalf of my Director General, Dr. Weber-Ndoro, who would very much have liked to have been here today. Unfortunately, he had a prior commitment, and so he asked me to represent him today. So now to move on. In thinking about the overall theme for this session, we're talking about a vision for civil society, and I've been asked specifically to talk about the intergovernmental and technical view and how gaps can be filled. So when I began to think about this, I began thinking about what are the gaps that we're actually talking about on the World Heritage List. When we talk about gaps, usually we're referring to two things. We're referring to gaps in the list itself. We're referring to gaps in usually regional, so there are gaps because Europe is maybe overrepresented and other regions are maybe underrepresented, and sometimes we talk about it from a thematic point of view. So for example, modern heritage is maybe underrepresented, archaeological heritage may be overrepresented, religious heritage may be overrepresented. That's one way to look at it, and that's usually the way we have looked at it in the World Heritage Convention. But I would actually like to be a little bit more holistic and look at it in a wider way, because there are some other gaps that we also need to be dealing with. We need to be dealing with the gap between a focus on nomination and inscription instead of conservation and management of sites that are already on the World Heritage List. That's actually a huge gap as far as I'm concerned. Everyone cares about getting sites on the list. They don't care so much about what happens to those sites once they're on the list. Not everyone, but I think that's one gap. There's a gap between the way we look at cultural heritage and natural heritage. I think that's another thing to look at, and I would also argue tangible and intangible heritage. So those are, I think, also gaps that we need to look at. And then another gap, and that's actually the theme of this particular section, let's say, is the gap in the involvement of civil society in the work of the World Heritage Committee. And I think that's also another very important gap that we need to be looking at. And yes, we still need to pay attention to the regional gaps. That is a problem. You know, Africa is underrepresented, but we have all of these gaps that we need to be looking at. Now, in terms of this theme of civil society, I was also thinking, well, you know, why ICCROM? Why would I be making this? Because ICCROM is an IGO. It's an intergovernmental organization. It's not civil society. You know, we're decidedly not. And the fact of the matter is that the World Heritage Convention is an intergovernmental process. It's made up of states parties. You know, the Constitution, the Convention, the Constitution of World Heritage, you know, talks about states parties, and decision making is made by states parties and by the committee specifically, representation of the states parties. And I think we need to recognize that as a let's say sort of as a framework, and again, that's, I think, where an important gap actually exists and something that we need to be working on. You know, the operational guidelines are approved by the committee. You know, decisions on what gets inscribed and what goes on the World Heritage List in danger are made by committee members who are states parties, and civil society is not really very present in that. And I think we need to recognize that, and we need to try to understand that. Now, that's not to say that civil society doesn't exist at all within this. The truth of the matter is that ICCROM is an NGO. It is, I would argue, a civil society organization. It's made up of professionals, it's heritage professionals, but it is actually an NGO. And I would argue is part of civil society. IUCN also is hybrid. IUCN is intergovernmental, but it is also non-governmental, and it's a hybrid. So I think, at least in terms of who the advisory bodies are, not ICCROM, we're intergovernmental fully, but the other two advisory bodies, I think there is at least a place, let's say, for civil society, and I'll come back to that again in a minute. But the other thing that I would want to mention in terms of thinking about civil society is it's not completely missing from the World Heritage Convention because, and you all know this, Article 5A states clearly that states parties should adopt a general policy which aims to give cultural and natural heritage a function in the life of the community. Well, the community is civil society. I mean, that's really what we're talking about when we talk about civil society. So it is there, but there's a problem with it. It's an object, it's not a subject. Civil society in that case is something that the convention is telling states parties to operate on, to operate on something, to be an actor on something, to bring life to the civil society, to populations, to local communities, and I think that's that's a bit of a problem that we need to be looking at. Now, since 1972, when the convention was adopted, we've begun to understand more and more that there is a need to work with local populations, local people, civil society, in order to ensure the good conservation and management of any heritage, not just World Heritage, but actually any heritage, with World Heritage as a subset of that. And in fact, I'm proud to say that ICCROM, already 15 years ago, started developing something that we call people-centered approaches to conservation. The idea behind that people-centered approaches is that people must be protagonists in the conservation of their heritage, not just spectators. So they have to be actors in the process. They must share in benefits, but they also must be involved in decision-making. They must be involved in management. They must be involved in conservation. As many of my friends in sub-Saharan Africa are fond of saying, nothing about us without us. And that's a very specific context in relation to Africa and its colonial history, but I think it's actually still something that's important for us to think about in a more general sense. We are not conserving the heritage for civil society. Civil society actually has to be a part of that, that process. So this can actually be done at many levels, and I'm going to make sort of some suggestions in a way. Even within, I would say, even within the current framework, at the level of the advisory bodies, for example, I think some of you are aware that there have been some efforts to add even more advisory bodies to the World Heritage System. Now, I'm not sure that I consider that to be such a good idea per se, adding additional advisory bodies, because I think we run the risk of losing sort of, let's say, a consistency of advice as we move forward, and I think we need to be careful about that. But having said that, I think it is the advisory bodies can actually start to involve civil society in a more serious way, and I think that's something that we need to be working on. ICCOMOS and IUCN could involve civil society more in their evaluation of nominations in their panels, for example. All of us, all three of us, could be using civil society more in examining state of conservation and taking the opinions of civil society into account as we carry out reactive monitoring missions, as we write state of conservation reports, et cetera. And I think that's something that we do need to think about more. Now, again, at the level of consistency, one of my concerns about too many advisory bodies is that if there's too much advice coming from too many different people and it's not being filtered, sometimes that does create problems. I actually recall, and Mekta will remember this, I'm sure, but there was a time when, and I'm talking not about nominations, but state of conservation reports, there was a time when within the state of conservation reports, ICCOMOS would make its comments, ICCROM, if we were involved in a particular site, would make our comments, the World Heritage Center would have their comments, and those comments wouldn't always match with each other. And the World Heritage Committee actually asked us to consolidate those. And it actually created a process where we have meetings on state of conservation between the advisory bodies and the World Heritage Center, where we can discuss things, and we can actually come out with a much stronger analysis and set of advice for the World Heritage Committee to discover. And I think, again, that's the sort of thing that I think we can work on with civil society. We can start bringing those ideas in. Now, it's also interesting that there's often a lack of civil society involvement with the states parties themselves. And I think states parties could use civil society much better as partners in all of the various processes of the World Heritage Convention. Tentative lists, why is that being done only in an office somewhere? And this is not accusatory to any one particular country, but why are tentative lists being drawn up in an office in a Ministry of Culture somewhere? Why isn't there a process within a country bringing together different actors within civil society to actually discuss that and come up with your tentative list? The development of nomination files, that's again something that I think could have a much stronger involvement of civil society, and again, I think conservation and management. Now, the problem with that, of course, is it's easy for me to say that here in a room at the front of a podium, but you're talking about 190, I can't remember now, 195, 196 states parties. And it's hard to get everyone in, to be doing that. But I think we do need to be encouraging that. And I think civil society could play or should play a much stronger role at the state party level in relation to World Heritage. Now, it's also true at the committee level, and I think that's also true at the committee level in terms of committee delegations. Sorry, I was talking about states parties and members of the committee. Nothing stops a state party from actually having on its delegation representatives of civil society in their countries. Expertise. The committee used to be much more expert than it is now. It's more political than it was in the past, at least when I started 25 years ago. But bringing that expertise in, again, it doesn't have to necessarily be expertise related to the national government. There's no reason why they couldn't be bringing civil society actors in as members of the delegation. So that's also something I think that one could think about. Having said all of that, I think the committee itself and the processes of the committee itself are still quite lacking in terms of the involvement of civil society. And that's because the committee tends to, I'm going to use the word jealously, but I don't mean that negatively, but it tends to jealously guard its decision-making and its debate and decision-making processes. And I think this is an area that, to be honest with you, there's been, I'll use the word failure here, there's been a failure to date to bring in more civil society. And I'm going to point, my example that I'm going to point to on this is what I consider to be my saddest day in 25 years of World Heritage, and that was the meeting in 2001 where the World Heritage Indigenous Peoples Council was, it was a proposal to have a council of indigenous people to deal with sites particularly related to indigenous issues. Not as an advisory body, but as an additional council to provide advice where it was, where a particular site warranted that issue. And while some members of the committee were very supportive of this, a significant number of them were not for a variety of reasons. And as the debate went on, I began to feel more and more sorry for the person, the woman who was actually making the presentation on behalf of the indigenous people. It was really the saddest day for me in 25 years. Another area that's lacking, I would say, is the fact that members of NGOs and civil societies, while they can attend the meeting as observers, World Heritage Committee, they can't speak until after decisions are taken. They're not allowed to take the floor. Now, that's also done for particular reasons related also to time management. And, again, those of you that have been in World Heritage for a long time will remember some very late nights where the committee sessions just went on interminably forever. And so in an attempt to deal with that, they said, okay, we need to limit the debate really to committee members, and then, someone can take the floor, an observer can take the floor, but only after the decisions have been taken. And I think that's also something that needs to be looked at, and something that I think needs to be that needs to be changed, and I think that's something that could theoretically be changed. The last area that I would talk about is, and you can't imagine ICCROM making a presentation anywhere and not talking about this, and that is in capacity building, because that is actually what our main area within the convention is, and this is something else where we can work, I think, with civil society very strongly. Part of that, and that's in many different prongs. One of them is obviously building capacity of civil society to work better within the World Heritage System, because the World Heritage System is complex. It's got jargon, it's got processes that are not always very clear. So one of the things that we can do is we can actually work to build capacity of civil society organizations in order to allow them to participate more effectively. A second area that we can be working with civil society is actually working on doing capacity building together, because actually it's the civil society that has a lot of information and a lot of important aspects or ways of thinking about things, and we need to be involving them in the capacity building, not only as subjects, but again, as protagonists of the capacity building. And I think that's especially true, again, when we talk about conservation and management of the cultural heritage. And I'll point to Mali. This has already been mentioned 2 or 3 times already. But when Lazare Alundu went to Mali, he could have never done the work of conservation, reconstruction, restoration without civil society. They had the skills, they had the knowledge, they had the time, they had everything. And Lazare could have never done what he did without a strong relationship with civil society. And UNESCO was able to take advantage of that. And I think we need to do that also with capacity building. So just to conclude, I just want to say that we strongly believe that this was meant to be a perspective from an intergovernmental organization or from intergovernmental organizations. ICCROM is an intergovernmental organization, but we strongly believe that it is in the interests of our member states, because of course we operate in the interests of our member states, it is in the interests of our member states that we work with civil society to improve the conservation and management of cultural heritage. And we've recognized that this is the only way that we can be effective in our mission. And it's something that I hope very much that the World Heritage Committee will be able to better understand this as time goes on. As we celebrate the 50th anniversary, World Heritage is at a crossroads. And in some ways it has never been more relevant and more well known around the world. And in other ways, it's not involving people enough, and especially not within the processes of the committee. So we are at this crossroads right now, and I think in order to remain relevant for the next 50 years, we're going to have to adopt, and again, I'll go back to ICCROM's phrasing for this, we're going to have to adopt people-centered approaches, and that's going to mean involving people, involving communities, involving civil society. So thank you all very much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you very much. On behalf of the ICCROM Library, I appreciate this very much.